please like our video and subscribe to RotoWire. Then go to rotowire.com/pod for a free 10-day trial.
Hi there, hockey fans, and welcome back to RotoWire's signature NHL Hockey Pod PuckCast with Statsman and AJ, brought to you with support from our pals at Owner's Box with their new way to enjoy fantasy sports. Friends, I'm Paul Bruno in Toronto, Ontario, and you can follow me at Statsman22. My co-host is AJ Scholes, who's a great follow at AJ Scholes24, based in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, which is pretty close to RotoWire headquarters over there in Madison. Good morning, AJ. I know we both celebrate birthdays tomorrow, and I got an idea how you'll be marking it, very unusually, in fact, but in the charity space, and I applaud you for that. Why don't you tell our listeners a bit about that?
Yeah, so my wife and her family have kind of hijacked my birthday. They've been going up to what's called the American Birkebeiner. It's a cross-country ski race. It's the biggest cross-country ski race in North America, so I've gotten into that as well. So it's normally a 50-kilometer race. Like I said, up in northern Wisconsin. This year with COVID protocols, it's a mere 43 kilometers. So, a little break for me probably shaves an hour off the amount of time I got to spend there. For our U.S. listeners, that's about 26 miles, give or take. But I've been doing that the last couple of years as part of Team ALS that raises money for the Wisconsin chapter of the ALS Association. Their goal being to, one, primarily find a cure for ALS, and then also to support families as they're dealing with ALS diagnoses and everything that comes along with that. So I had to take last year off because our youngest daughter was born, but back at it this year for another round and approaching. I would need a lot of our listeners to chime in. I can post the link. I'd love the extra support, but approaching a overall raised amount over the last several years of $4,000. So really hoping if it's not this year, I'll get there next year for sure.
That's awesome, AJ. I know I've shared this with you privately, but ALS has touched my family life with my mother-in-law getting taken hold of this disease. About a year ago, she was taken from us. In fact, after a very brief battle with it, it was a very violent case that she had, and that was one of the worst things I've ever seen in terms of a person's decline, and I'll never forget that. And I applaud you for doing what you're doing in this space. I think everybody should find a way to incorporate charitable endeavors in their life. Mine has been with Road Hockey to Conquer Cancer. I've spoken about it in this show over the years, and that's going along. We're coming around to our 10th celebration of that event this September if things loosen up with the COVID protocols. So I'm going to be still involved in that. But I applaud you for what you're doing. Very important research is being done in that space, and I want to hope that everybody who's listening is spared from ever seeing this disease up close and personal. It's not fun. So good on you for doing it. And a little bit of a commercial for the charitable work that we both do, I guess, there. And in terms of another commercial opportunity, AJ, we owe a debt to our sponsors at Owner's Box, and I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about what's going on there.
Hey, NHL fans, Owner's Box is here to reinvent the way you play fantasy sports this season. Owner's Box is not DFS. They're the first ever weekly fantasy sports platform that combines the best elements of the industry into one product. Owner's Box is a head-to-head elimination style format that keeps players engaged through live snake drafts, social interaction, and a new layer of strategy that allows you to become the ultimate fantasy GM. The best part about weekly fantasy sports is there's no long-term commitment. Users are able to draft a new team every single day and participate in different types of contests to keep the fantasy experience fresh and fun so you're never out of the game. Compete with your opponent over 7 days of fierce competition and get paid out weekly. No more falling subject to unfair payouts, as up to 50% of users win money. Owner's Box also allows users to brand themselves and engage socially across the platform in multiple different ways, add friends, create custom leagues, and rank up to elevate the trash talk and competition to the next level. Think you have what it takes to be a weekly fantasy guru? Head over to ownersbox.com and start making a name for yourself today. In honor of the NHL season, if you sign up free now, Owner's Box will match your first deposit up to $500. What are you waiting for? Head over to ownersbox.com/rotowire to claim your bonus and join the new wave of fantasy sports.
All right, partner, we swing into our look at 31 teams. I go first this week, and I looked down the list, and I realized only one team did not play last week, and it's one of your teams. So you have a bit of a lesser load this week than I do. I do 2 more than you, but it'll even up over the long haul, I'm sure. But I'm encouraged about the fact that fewer teams are being affected by the COVID situation. That's a good sign. I take that as a sign that things are improving. So let's be optimistic as we go through this. We start with the Anaheim Ducks. They went 0-3 last week. Sam Steele leading the scoring. It was very limited scoring, though. He scored 2 goals to lead the team, and the rest of the group was pretty much offensively challenged. And I want to focus on the left wing of this roster, AJ. The storyline here is that Max Jones moves up into the left wing role on the top line, while U.S. Junior World Championship MVP makes his debut this week, and that is Trevor Zegras. I was very impressed with this guy at the World Juniors, AJ. I don't know if you caught any of the action, but he was head and shoulders above everybody that played in this tournament. And I like the fact that they've given him a little bit of a chance to see what life is like from the stands watching the games in the early going, and he's been practicing with the team, but now he's going to get a look alongside Sam Steele on that second scoring line and Jacob Silfverberg on the right wing. That's a pretty good situation for him to get started in, and I'm anxious to see whether the junior experience translates into the NHL for him immediately, or if there'll be growing pains like we've seen with a couple of fellas on the New York Rangers roster that we'll talk about later. We also want to point out that because of this situation on left wing with those 2 players, Danton Heinen has lost playing time in the scoring unit, but a lot of that is his own doing, AJ. Only 4 shots on goal in the last 4 games played, an indication that things have gone south for a guy who they expected big things from. But they have 3 viable options there, and I think you're going to see that movement up and down for a while. On the blue line, Hampus Lindholm is dealing with a lower body injury, and that means the offensive load will fall once again to Cam Fowler to run the power play and carry the team offensively from the back end. He's probably their only option right now that's healthy in terms of the scoring capabilities from the blue line.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, they thought they were going to get the Kevin Shattenkirk of last year's, they thought they'd get the Tampa Bay Kevin Shattenkirk, but they've clearly instead gotten the New York Ranger Kevin Shattenkirk here. Just 5 assists in 19 games and really not producing at any sort of level there for the Ducks. And I too, I'm excited to see Zegras and what he can bring. I definitely think maybe you take a flyer on him in DFS when Anaheim plays next, and just see what you can get out of him, because his price tag is not going to be high. So if you get anything, it's going to certainly be a good time, a good production value for you. In Arizona, a 1-1 week for them. Phil Kessel, really the driver of the offense. Last 4 games, 2 goals and 2 assists. About half of that coming on the power play. So decent production out of him. A bit of a slow start, obviously. We've talked about Phil earlier in the year and it being down a little bit, but obviously he seems to be rediscovering that, which is always a good thing for the team. Outside of, Phil, it's kind of some of their usual guys that are producing. Clayton Keller, Christian Dvorak. Derek Brassard had 2 goals in his last 4 games, so he's starting to find something there as well. So, maybe a sign that things are improving a little bit for Arizona. Offensively, they've been a little lacking, for lack of a better term, but they're still right there in the mix. They're tied with 19 points with Colorado and LA. Of course, they've played a few more games than either of those teams, so that's going to hurt their chances to get in the playoffs. But if they can get this type of production out of Kessel, I think they'll stand a good chance of finishing in that top 4.
Well, and AJ, I want to talk about the way they've distributed the minutes there. When you look at the first, second, and third lines, Phil is listed on the third line, but he's playing about 17 minutes a game owing to that power play. And really, there's nobody on the offensive side of the puck that's playing around 20 minutes a game, like some teams are going really top heavy with the first line. But in Anaheim, Arizona, rather, it looks like the 3 top scoring lines are all spread out kind of evenly, and the playing time is reflected there. So I wouldn't lose too much sleep over the fact that, RotoWire is showing Phil on the third line. It really isn't your typical top three lines in terms of minute distribution there. Just a note on that. In terms of the Boston Bruins, AJ, they were 1-1 last week, and they played, of course, one of the games in Lake Tahoe and blew out the Flyers in that one. Pretty much the beat goes on, though. The top line has been the line that's carried the load here offensively, clearly, and Pasternak added 4 more goals to his totals, and he's on the verge of being among the league leaders, even though he's missed a whole chunk of games. That's how good he has been and that line has been. But really, the story here is about the overall defensive stinginess of this group, which is a surprising thing to me, noting that there's been some changeover on the back end with a couple of key departures. They're still one of the stingiest teams in the NHL, and a large part of that is also the responsibility of their forwards. David Krejci among them. He's listed day-to-day with a lower body injury right now, but they're going to just slide Charlie Coyle into that second unit in between Nick Ritchie and Craig Smith, and I don't expect them to miss too much of a beat. It affords the club to look at 3 youngsters on the third line, which is a unique look here. Jack Studnicka between Jake DeBrusk and Anders Bork. A look at the Bruins' future, perhaps, on that unit. AJ, Andre Kasha still on the sidelines as well. That's 2 key pieces missing from the forward group. And on the back end, similarly, Jeremy Lauzon is listed as day-to-day, joining Matt Grzelcyk in the infirmary, leaving Charlie McAvoy as really the only offensively gifted player on that back end. Urho Vakanainen is getting more play time and partnered with Brandon Carlo in a bit of a new look there. So there's been juggling going on the forward and defense ranks, but this team is still one of the best in the conference.
Yeah, I think, the concern with it for me, more than, as you alluded to, David Krejci obviously is a solid player, but they have a decent enough depth at the forward group, and that top line is still together, that I'm more concerned about the defensive injuries. You're talking about 3 guys now potentially out, and, guys, Zorbro, like, maybe he would start. He's kind of on the fringe, 6, 7, somewhere in there, but Lawson and Grzelcyk, like, both of those guys are in their top 6 for sure, possibly even top 4. So now you're looking like, if Lawson doesn't play, now you're putting Kevin Miller or Steve Kampfer in, who are established veterans, but they're not guys you want playing probably more than 15 to 17 minutes at this point in their career. And then that means you're giving more minutes to Vakanainen, as you mentioned. So it's starting to get to that point of being a bit of a concern, and you hope that for their sake that it doesn't take too much of a dip, but I'm not really expecting that. I'm sure they'll power through. In Buffalo, look, the story has to be Jeff Skinner. The fact that he went from being benched, they scratched him on last night. He didn't even make the lineup. I mean, you're paying a guy literally $9 million a year to sit in the press box right now. That's certainly not a good sign. So you have to wonder if they're going to look at trying to move him. That contract makes it almost impossible when you consider the fact, even if they retained half of the salary, which is going to set them up poorly into the future. I wouldn't want to do that. But even if they did, taking on $4.5 million in cap space this year is pretty cost prohibitive even at that mark. So I just don't know what Buffalo is going to do at this point. That this contract has just gotten bad. His numbers don't look good. He's not in that last game. He didn't even play any time on the power play either. So they haven't even been able to utilize him in that role. So it's a big question mark for Buffalo, what they do with Jeff Skinner and how they move forward. And I'm not sure I have the answer to that one.
You know what? And if you want to just substitute one name, I'll throw Taylor Hall into what you just said. And apart from it being a long-term hit for the player that you mentioned, it's a short-term hit for Taylor Hall. 1 season, $8 million, but he's only got 1 goal to show for it as well. So 2 real big problems in Skinner and Hall and their lack of production. And even Jack Eichel, only 2 goals for a guy who looks at the top of the scoring leadership and says, I'm every bit as good as McDavid and Matthews, but here I am mired in a mess. And it's starting to reflect in his play too. So there's really a lot of unfortunate news in Buffalo. bad news even. And you can add even on defense, Rasmus Ristolainen dealing with lingering effects from the COVID virus in his life, and still out of the lineup with no real return date in place for him. And along with Jake McCabe being out, that's two key pieces on that blue line that are out of the lineup. So that puts a real tough load on Linus Ullmark and Carter Hutton in the nets. A real tough situation in Buffalo, and they're looking like an also-ran this year already. I think you can tell that they're going to be among the sellers this year at the trade deadline, this early in the season. The season's a write-off for them. In terms of Carolina, this is a team that's one of the pleasant surprises so far this year, and it's all about the offense, AJ. I'll just rattle off some of the numbers from last week from some of these players. The players that are familiar to us as scoring leaders did turn up. Teravainen with a goal and 5 assists. He's dealing with an upper body injury listed day-to-day right now. Vinny Trocheck slots in as a second-line center, but scored like a first-liner last week, 3 goals and 1 helper. Nino Niederreiter finding his groove there, and I thought it was only a matter of time before this guy would fit in somewhere as a scoring line winger. He picked up 5 points last week, and that's just scratching the surface of what he can be, I think. Sebastian Aho, also 5 points for him. Martin Etchkach, 4 points. You see where I'm going here? There's getting a ton of offense. We're talking about only 4 games played. They won 3 and lost 1 in overtime. They even got contributions from a youngster on the back end who's worth a look. Jake Bean with 4 helpers. I think this guy's going to be a key part of this back end for a long time. So the news is all pretty good there for a team that's battling with Tampa for the division leadership, and I didn't see that coming.
Well, and not to mention the goalie situation either. You know, Peter Mrazek out with a thumb injury. You thought maybe that would result in a dip of play, but they've gotten solid net minding from James Reimer. He's 2-1 in his last 3 with a .91 save percentage. And meanwhile, the youngster Alex Nedeljkovic had a .934 save percentage in his 2 appearances. So, you know, they're getting solid net minding. Hard to really find something that's not working for this team. Honestly, it'll be interesting to see if Mrazek's return causes any sort of problem there. I mean, not that you blame the player, but, you know, different dynamic with a different goalie. They've been having Reimer and Nedeljkovic go every other night, kind of back and forth. Obviously, Mrazek's going to want to be more of a every night kind of guy. And what do? You have a player in Nedeljkovic who's going to be your netminder of the future. Do you send him back to the taxi squad or send him back to the minors? When he's playing this well, it's a tough situation. It's a good problem to have, obviously, but I'm very interested to see what they do coming out of that injury. In Calgary, they've got some good news as Sean Monahan was back in action last night and got a goal in and an assist. So he had missed the previous 2 games with an injury. So good news for them. And I think that really provides them. Look, Michael Backlund is a very capable guy to fill in as a second-line center, but I think I'd rather have him as my third-line center. So getting Monahan back. Sam Bennett was the right winger there. I think that's a good spot for him to be playing with Johnny Gaudreau. And I think that'll help him kind of get out of the funk that he started the season in. So pretty much all good news for them with the exception of Jacob Markstrom picking up an upper body injury. That was we try not to talk about last night's games, but too much news for this team coming out of that. You know, Markstrom had, that, like I said, upper body injury. So we're going to see your favorite guy, Paul, Big Save Dave, as you like to call him, for a little bit, depending on the length of injury, but it'll be one to watch because Markstrom has been a pretty big workhorse for them so far this year.
No question. That's a key point, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think you're going to see a leveling off of the goalie split there, and David Riddich really did himself a big favor by turning in such a great performance against the Maple Leafs last night and a shutout win in his return to the nets. And Markstrom did play a lot of hockey, and I don't think he's a guy that you note in the same class as Vasilevsky and a couple others around the league, Hallebuck and even Freddie Anderson in Toronto, who are capable year after year of handling a big workload. Markstrom really did that for the first time last couple of seasons, and this year with the compressed schedule, it looks like it just simply came at a big toll for him. He was seeing a lot of rubber, and Riddich came up big, and maybe we will see that leveling off in the near future. So that'd be a boon for Calgary anyway going forward. The Chicago Blackhawks, they have to rate as probably the biggest surprise for me, or one of the biggest for sure. They're actually competing for a playoff spot. I didn't think that was in their future this season. They went 2-1 last week, and it's a mix of the youngsters and veterans that are doing it, and that's a great recipe here. Kubalik with 2 goals, Kane with 4 points, Soderberg even with 3 points in his last 4 games played, locked in now as the number 2 center ahead of Dylan Strome. Lankinen continues to be the story in the Nets, though. He started 11 of the last 14 games, and his numbers are really solid. They've even got another youngster who's moving along the learning curve on defense alongside Duncan Keith, and that's Ian Mitchell. This is going to be good for this guy's development. I'll throw a U.S. college reference out there for you, AJ. 89 points over his last 3 years at the U of Denver, and he got his first NHL goal last week. Clearly, this guy's got a bit of an offensive upside, and he's going to be learning from one of the best whoever did it in recent times, in Duncan Keith. Steady at both ends of the ice, and Mitchell could certainly learn a lot by just looking over at what his defensive partner is doing on a nightly basis.
Well, you look at those Chicago teams that won cups, they were driven by guys like Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook having solid defensively. And I see shades of that in what they have moving forward with Ian Mitchell, Adam Bakwas, and even Wyatt Kalinick. I think all these guys have, really solid upside potential for the Blackhawks, and it's a good sign of things to come. I think, you look at, a couple teams every year. I feel like there's one team that's seems to be right about there, seems to be getting better, and you call any success they have in that year as a bonus year. For me, this is a bonus year for Chicago. If they have success this year, that's kind of unforeseen, but it benefits you in the long term, and I think it'll be good for them to have that, especially with these younger guys and a changing of the guard, right? We had Corey Crawford for years in the Nets. Now we're looking at Kevin Lankinen. We're seeing a transition in some ways from Duncan Keith. Not that Keith's done playing; he's still doing well, but transition from Keith and Seabrook to these youngsters. You've got guys like DeBrincat and Kubalik stepping up in the absence of Jonathan Taves, and Andrew Shaw's out as well. So if I'm a Blackhawks fan, it's a really encouraging thing to see. In Columbus, there's some not so encouraging news as Elvis Merzlikins picks up an injury here. They're listing him as week to week. His numbers haven't been great this year. They haven't been bad. He's got a 2.81 goals against average in 9 appearances, but that's going to kind of force them into using either Joonas Korpisalo more, which we saw, that might not be the best for him. He seems to favor a little bit more time off, or they're going to have to give Matthias Kivalinkis some looks, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for them either, but it's not ideal, obviously, to have your kind of 1B netminder, or 2 1B, whatever you want to call it, pick up an injury like that. For offensively, they've continued to get okay production. Roslovic's numbers kind of finally dropped off after a really strong start to his time in Columbus, but they're getting Patrick Laine chipped in 2 assists in their last 3 games. They've got a pair of goals from Boone Jenner and Cam Atkinson, respectively. So there's good things there, but I think the goaltending thing is a concern. They've obviously been without Zach Werenski for a couple of days here too, and that's, there's not really anybody they have that can replace him. Vladislav Gavrikov is going to see the biggest uptick in minutes, but he's definitely not a Werenski replacement, that's for sure.
And that's putting a lot more pressure on Seth Jones. Of course, now he becomes the unquestioned linchpin to backstop that power play. David Savard is another key offensive defenseman that's missing from the group. So a lot of pressure on Seth Jones to carry the mail. Joonas Korpisalo is not playing the way he was last year by a long shot too. So some question marks in the Nets for me as well. But boy, oh boy, Winnipeg Jets must be looking over and seeing Laine and Roslovic, first liners on this club, and maybe thinking they may have given up a little bit too much here, though they got to be quite happy with the guy that they got over there. We'll talk about him a little bit later in the program as well. Colorado Avalanche, this is a team that played a series of games against Las Vegas and had the advantage when I see it. They went 2-1 in the 3 games overall, and they are featuring, of course, Nate McKinnon, 2 goals and 2 assists, leading the offense. But Grubauer had a nice week for them too. 2 game starts, 2 wins, and only 4 goals against. He's been pretty good on the season, though. I would say fantastic even. 167 is the goals against average, 936 a save percentage. For me, and I don't know, this might ruffle your feathers a little bit, but I think he's the early season Vezina leader by a good margin when I look around the league, AJ, in the early returns. Outstanding effort by a young man in the nets.
Yeah, it's definitely been, interesting to watch. I don't think he would have been somebody I would list as a candidate for the Vezina at any point here. But, as you said, he's had some decent outings. They've been relying on him more than I think I expected when you consider, Pablo Francouz, I think, was going to be, able to take a little bit more of a share of the workload there from Grubauer, but he's been out and is no nearer to getting back. And then they also have Hunter Miska hasn't been available after having to enter the COVID protocol. So their other option is Adam Werner. So I expect to see pretty heavy Grubauer workload the rest of the way. And they'll continue to ride him as much as they can. You look on the year, he's only sat 2 games. I'm sorry. So they've been playing him a lot, 13 of 15, and I expect that to continue. Dallas, as we mentioned, no games this past week, not because of COVID, because of weather-related concerns and the problems they've been having down in Texas with power and water. And so I'll just add an interesting story that came out of that is a handful of the veteran guys there had brought in families and players. Jamie Benn, Anton Hudobin, a couple of those guys had these younger guys and or other players with families who maybe didn't have power were staying with them. And so it was great to see kind of their veteran leadership group there take these guys in and really support the team in this kind of circumstance.
Yeah, that's an ultimate team building exercise out of a crisis like this. That the way they banded together and helped the community, it will bear some fruit in the long run. But hope things settle down in Dallas. We up here in the north, we are more used to dealing with snowy situations, and maybe the people in Texas are looking at this thing. What the hell is going on here? Is this the sky is falling or something? But hopefully the worst is over for them. In Detroit, the worst just seems to continue for this club. 1-2-1 was the record last week. Considering they only scored 6 goals, that tells me the goaltending had a little bit to do with any success that they had. Consider that offensive linchpin here is Dylan Larkin, only 3 assists in his last 10 games played. And after a nice start, Bobby Ryan really has been in a slump. 1 goal, 2 helpers in his last 10 games played. Among the forwards, it seems like only Robbie Fabry is accounting for much offense with 5 points in his last 6 games to kind of lead that pack. But this team that's offensively challenged needs to shut things down defensively, and they did a decent job of that last week to get 3 points, but it's going to be a long road ahead if they just can't find a way to get people like Larkin and Mantha to contribute. I find it odd that they put a guy like Darren Helm on the left wing on the first line too. This guy's not really an offensive juggernaut of any kind, but they're waiting for developments for the development of Philip Zadina. Been very slow in that regard. He talked a little bit a big game when he first came in to his first NHL camp and really hasn't delivered since then. Val Filppula has moved around now. Instead of playing center, they got him listed as left wing on the third line too. I would sooner see him on the first line than Darren Helm, I would say, but really the pickings are really slim along that left side, AJ, and that's just one of a few problems here that this thin roster does have at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at the net minding, and to your point, Paul, the numbers aren't really that bad. Jonathan Bernier, 1-1 in his last 3 games, and a .944 save percentage. So clearly, the goaltending isn't necessarily the problem here. They just need to get some offense. To your point, one team that's having no lack of offense right now is the Edmonton Oilers. 3-1 last week. As you did earlier, Paul, I'll just rattle off some numbers. You got McDavid, 3 goals, 6 assists. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, 4. Nurse, 4 assists. Chiasson, 3 goals. Draisaitl, 2-2. Like, it's just everybody contributing. Your former Maple Leaf Tyson Barrie with 4 assists as well, and so they are just continuing to just steamroll everybody, and that's not going to stop. And then on top of that, they're getting decent net minding out of a guy like Mike Smith there with his return. I definitely think this team was starting to flounder a little bit with the heavy workload that Mikko Koskinen was facing. And Smith just seems to stabilize that. Now, granted, a .896 save percentage in his last 3 games, but a pair of wins. And I think the divided workload is good for Koskinen. He played in just 2 games, went 1-1 with a .947 save percentage. So I think they're better suited having both these guys available. And then they can just keep it close enough. These guys don't even have to be good, just good enough with that kind of firepower in front of them.
Right, and I want to give a nod to defenseman Darnell Nurse. This guy's numbers, AJ, are among the very best that any defenseman has in the NHL. Consider he's on a career-best scoring pace with 16 points in his first 20 games played, along with a +13, and he plays the game very tough. I'd hate to be going down the wing on his side of the ice because he'll take your head off at the first opportunity, as well as showing the offensive side. This guy's really a very physical presence, so they got a gem there, and he's clearly emerged as the top guy on the back end in Edmonton. Though Tyson Barrie's having a nice rebirth, as you mentioned. Every time I look at him, I think I don't recognize this guy from what he was last year at all. So a complete 180 from him, and good on him. In Florida, it's all about the offense here too. There's been a few teams here. So I highlight the numbers to show you that it's the veteran leadership that is taking hold here in these places. Barkov and Huberdeau combined for 6 and 7 points respectively. Alex Wenberg providing secondary scoring with a couple of goals and assists. Patrick Hornquist, a guy that I know we both have a lot of time for, a rugged guy who is a good net front presence, 2 more goals, 2 assists. Keith Yandel, undersold as one of the better offensive defensemen in the league with 4 more helpers. And I guess maybe the coaching staff is listening to our show because I've been beating the drum for Chris Driedger to take on more of a net minding share. He did that and picked up 3 wins last week, 3 game starts. 9 goals against, a little bit high for what we'd like to see out of him, but still clearly outplaying the veteran Bobrovsky in the nets, and they're giving him more playing time. A youngster who is doing a little bit of making a little bit of noise there is Lemiko, who is factoring into the offense here. AJ, he is a Finnish extraction and getting some looks. He's played up and down the lineup, listed now as a 4th line center, but he's moved around on the wings as well and factored into the offense to chip in a couple of goals last week. So it's not all about the veterans, as I said at the outset. They're getting production from up and down the lineup here, and it's no wonder they're contending for the leadership of the division the way they're going right now.
The workload for Driedger continues to be heavy too. He played and won last night too. So you're talking 4 wins, 4 starts in the team's last 5 games. Like, it's mind-boggling to see Sergei Bobrovsky sitting on the sidelines, but at this point, there's nothing they can do. Chris Driedger has forced their hand at this point, and they're going to have to continue to, utilize him in probably more of a role than anybody really expected because his numbers have just been so good. Another player that's kind of forced his team's hand this season has been Cal Petersen. His time in LA has been really good. But despite that, they continue to ride Jonathan Quick, and rightly so. He's got 3 wins in his last 3 games with a .975 save percentage. Cal Petersen, his lone appearance in the last 4 games was a winning effort as well. So they're getting good net minding out of LA, and I think that's about what they're going to need to rely on. They have a handful of guys that can produce and score. Dustin Brown has 4 goals in his last 4 games. Trevor Moore has 2 goals in his last 4 games, and so they're definitely getting some offensive production here. But if those 2 netminders continue to thrive at this level, there's just no stopping this team in what's kind of a weaker West. I think that 4th spot all along has been up for grabs. I personally didn't expect LA to be one of the teams that would be competing for it, but everything's wide open there. And they seem to be in the mix with a really good week.
Yeah, good point by you. We kind of panned the West Coast teams in the States in our preseason predictions, but Los Angeles has bucked that trend, and it's been a combination of the veteran group as well as some youngsters that they're trying to nurture and bring along their own learning curves, and it's shown in the mix of scoring contributions this week. You mentioned Kopitar and Doughty. We mentioned about every week. They're also among the league team leaders last week with 4 points each. But then Gabriel Velarde has 3 points. Trevor Moore has 2 points. Alex Iafallo has 3 points. That's part of the younger guard that's moving in. And you mentioned Jonathan Quick. He had 2 game starts last week with 2 wins and only 2 goals against, finding his groove for the first time this season. That's only going to help this club going forward if that keeps up, because the net minding has lagged a little bit behind the offense that the team has been able to generate, and that's primarily why they're in a 4th place spot right now. And a team they're battling with is the Minnesota Wild. They went 2-1 last week, and it's Kevin Fiala has been a stud for this team for a long time, and he led the scoring parade with 3 goals and 1 helper. But I want to talk about Kakkonen in the nets. 3 games started last week, 2 wins, 5 goals against. Now he started 9 of the last 11 games. I didn't think he'd get that big a share of the net, but again, performing like a couple other youngsters. We mentioned Lankinen in Chicago. So a couple of younger goalies are making the name for themselves, and this guy's doing it here, keeping many relevant as well. It looks like Victor Rask is getting more reps as a frontline scoring center here, chipping in with 3 goals in his last 3 games here as well, AJ. So there is good news all around the roster, and that's why Minnesota's relevant in their division to date. They're getting contributions from unexpected places, and Matt Zuccarello is active for this team again, and that's great news for the club. He picked up 7 points in his last 3 games, and they really missed him in a big way for a long time last year as well. But you're starting to see just how important this guy is, or can be, to the success of the Wild going forward, and they're a tougher out than they were 2 weeks ago.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Getting Zuccarello back has been huge for them. And I think it's big for these younger guys like, Kirill Kaprizov, who's going to play with him on that second line. I think it's a great opportunity for him to learn from Zuccarello and kind of emulate what he does on the ice. And to your point about Kakkonen, look, Cam Talbot was out on the, unavailable for a stretch there with the COVID protocols. And Kakkonen really took the reins, and right now it looks like he's not going to let up anytime soon. Overall, I think eventually they'll settle into more of an even split between these two, but he is making the most of his opportunity there and continuing to thrive for Minnesota right now. We'll take a look at Paul's favorite team, the Montreal Canadiens, who gave you a gift last week, an early birthday present as they went 0-1-1. I know you love watching them flounder, and nobody really stepping up in any sort of huge way. Now, granted, they only played 2 games over that stretch, but you've got, Suzuki a goal, Kotkaniemi a goal, Perry a goal, Toffoli and Byron both scoring a goal, and that's about it in terms of offensive production here. So it's definitely a concern in some ways, but at the end of the day, look, Montreal is not a team necessarily that needs to be built around high offense when you've got a guy like Carey Price in the nets now. I understand he struggled his most recent game, but that's a blip on the radar. If Carey Price has a bad game, it's a blip. I assure you that. They're still getting solid net mining out of Jake Allen, maybe not quite the same level they were earlier. So I expect them to bounce back. I think it's a little bit too early to call this their demise. Now, the other fact is they're at 21 points, which puts them at 4th, but they've got 1 game in hand on Winnipeg and 3 games in hand on both Toronto and Edmonton. So a couple wins there, and they're right back up towards the top of that division.
Yeah, they have to be a little bit concerned with the lack of scoring down the middle of the ice. Nick Suzuki really cooling off. Philip Deneau struggling to be a consistent offensive force. But I'll tell you what, I was impressed by Jesperi Kotkaniemi when he played against the Leafs. He showed great speed and hustle, more than I've seen in most outings from him on the offensive side of the puck. So I think there's some growth happening there for sure. And long term, the top 3 at center should settle in and be more productive. But the lack of goal scoring that they're getting from these guys is almost incomprehensible to me when you consider the talent that they're playing with. And I wonder where they'd be without the additions of Toffoli and Josh Anderson, who have led this offense in a big, big way. You take away their efforts, and this is a really puny-looking offense. But they have them in tow, and they're getting great performances out of both of those guys, and they will be a factor in this division. I don't expect their current struggles to continue. New Jersey Devils, this is a team that got some good news last week. We'll get to that in a sec, but they went 2-2, and you're starting to see some offensive numbers here translated into their recent success. Pavel Zacha is a youngster that they're counting on and to grow into a key role here. 2 goals and 2 assists from him. Kyle Palmieri, 3 goals and 3 assists to lead the offense. Severson, a guy that I have a lot of time for on the blue line, showing that he can be a contributor from the back end with 3 helpers. Jesper Bratt also chipping in from his wing position with 3 assists as well. In the nets, Mackenzie Blackwood continues to get a lot of the action. 3 game starts, 2 wins and 7 goals against for him. But they're waiting for a couple other guys to really lead the way here, and one of them is Andreas Johnson. Maybe finally finding a bit of a comfort level, 3 points in his last 3 games, locked in as left wing on the second scoring line. But the biggest news of all is Niko Hesher finally made his debut, and they rewarded him as well with the captaincy here. He's going to be locked in as the #1 center. It may take him a couple of games to get going, but this is a guy that you got to look at. Could be a real cheap option in DFS play, and when he gets his groove going in the center slot and on the power play here, he should be a dynamic force that really changes the look, at least the top end of this offense for me.
Well, I'll just add there was, a certain, Canadian that got a lot of attention last week for playing 1,000 games, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that we shouldn't overlook the fact that Travis Zajac also got to that threshold this weekend. 197 goals over his career, 337 assists. And look, he's only the second player from that 2004 draft class to get to the 1,000 game mark behind Alexander Ovechkin. So quick shout out to Travis Zajac, who obviously has been underappreciated outside of New Jersey for hitting that milestone in light of who else got there this weekend. For the Nashville Predators, this is a team that went 1-1 last week. Calle Jarnkrok, rather, I merged his first and last name there. Had 2 goals last week. Their biggest news is that they might get Ryan Johansson and or Brad Richardson back either today or their next game. And so I think having those guys to fill out the lineup is really going to be a boost there. Now, I get Johansson has not had a great start to the year. He's still looking for his first goal of the season despite 10 games. Has just 16 shots on net for those 10 games. Look, we always talk, me personally, about that 2 shots a game threshold. He's going to need to put a lot more pucks on net if he's going to break through and get back on the score sheet for the first time this year. But whenever they do get them back, that's going to really help their depth. You figure Johansson slots in on the first line with Philip Forsberg, Brad Richardson probably on the 4th line for them. But, that's a tough, wily veteran that, can really help them down the middle. And I think that's going to improve this team's fortunes moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I can almost look at the centers in this situation and say they're older versions of what's going on in Montreal. The lack of scoring from guys who've done it in the past, Granlund, Duchesne, and Johansson when healthy. These guys have been productive players in this league. They're just not showing it in the last couple of years here, to be quite frank. Granlund, in fact, getting top line minutes despite the fact he hasn't scored anything in the last 5 games. So they'll be welcoming Johansson back just to see if he can get a different look and a different result. They're have an opportunity to play with some dynamic wingers here in Forsberg and Arvidsson, who are really skilled offensive players and really haven't been hampered by the fact that they haven't had a scoring line center in place. They've still continued to do their part, but it really helped this team if they can sort out the center of the ice going forward, AJ. Up next, we're going to talk about the New York Islanders. This is a team that has relied on centers to drive their offense. Brock Nelson and Jean-Gabriel Pageau picking up 3 points each last week, but they've got some steady wingers too who have chipped in regularly, and it's familiar names. Anders Lee, he had a tough start to the season, but he's rolling along, got 3 goals last week. And Josh Bailey is one of the better playmaking wingers. He has 5 assists to his ledger that he added last week. But it's on the defense and in net where there are some key developments for me. Nick Leddy is finally solidified a look for me that tells me he's put some struggles from the last year and a half behind him, where he seemed to lose his offensive game and part of his defensive game as well, AJ. But he seems to be back and all sorted out. 3 assists added to his ledger, as well as a decent-looking plus-minus. Ilya Sorokin finally paid a dividend in the Nets with his first win, and it was a shutout performance. So good on him for that key effort. To maybe make a name for himself, he'll have to put a string of these games together. Otherwise, you look for Semyon Varlamov to continue to take the load. So that'll be something to watch, the goalie situation over here. But it's also notable here that they've really changed up the look on their third line. Austin Czarnik and Oliver Wahlstrom, both guys who have played up and down this lineup in the past, are up from the taxi squad to flank Pajot on that third line. And wouldn't it be nice for the Islanders to stretch their offense a little bit beyond their top 2 units? Because right now they're profiled as a defense-first team, and they've always been. But it'd be nice to augment that with some offensive upside. Scott Mayfield showing a better level of comfort on the back end with new partner Nick Leddy. I talked about Nick Leddy's success. Maybe he's found a good relationship with Mayfield, a guy who's bounced around this roster, but getting top 4 minutes right now. They're both looking good at both ends of the ice in the last 5 games, and that only adds to the overall structure of the Islanders. It's a formidable foe, I think.
I've got a Twitter challenge for our listeners out there. I want them to go on to Twitter and convince me that there's a better third-line center in the league right now than Jean-Gabriel Pageau. I don't think you can make a better argument for that. 7 goals, 4 assists in 18 games this year. 4 of those points coming on the power play as well. So I just don't think there's a better third-line center anywhere in the league right now, and that's really a boon for the Islanders to have the guy who's number 2 in goals on the team anchoring that group and makes them hard to match up against and really a dynamic trio. I'll flip to the other Rangers club, and I'll talk about the on-ice product first. The Rangers went 2-1 last week. Colin Blackwell, 2 goals. Pavel Buchnevich, a goal and 3 assists. So getting some decent numbers there. Obviously, the biggest thing around them right now is news came out yesterday. Artemi Panarin going to take a leave of absence from the team in light of allegations regarding a 2011 assault, which has been linked to his criticism of Russian President Vladimir Putin. I think what's telling, the NHL teams or organizations, it doesn't matter what league, are very cautious with anything of this sort. But you look at the statement from the Rangers, and this is pretty definitive in their support for him, saying, Artemi vehemently and unequivocally denies the allegations. They even say in their statement, this fabricated story. So I think the fact that the team came out so strongly in support of it definitely lends credence to the fact that this is not a real, allegation that this event didn't happen. Again, the team statement even ends by calling them unfounded allegations. And so, unfortunately, from a fantasy perspective with Panarin, I think you have to stash him, even though there's no clear indication. Is this a week? Are we talking months here before we're going to see him again? But a player of his level, I think you're really kind of stuck and kind of have to stash him, Paul. Before we got on air here, we were talking very similarly to when Pierre-Luc Dubois got traded and had to have the 14-day quarantine. Obviously, you're not going to drop a player, but what do you do when you don't have a guy available for 2 weeks? And it's a tough situation for the Rangers, obviously tough situation for Panarin, but our focus, of course, is the fantasy aspect, and I don't envy any fantasy owners for Panarin right now, given the uncertainty there.
Yeah, I echo your sentiments. A very sensitive situation dating back to allegations that are 10 years old, but the Russian machine, as I'll call the political aspect of that country, it's got tentacles everywhere, as we have realized in recent years. And this is just another one that has impacted the New York Rangers and Panarin's family. So they're going to give him every minute that he needs to sort things out in that regard. And in the meantime, it's going to hamper this offense. Zibanejad's going to move into the center spot with different wingers here, Lafreniere and Kreider, and Ryan Strome with Buchnevich and Phil Di Giuseppe. Phil Di Giuseppe might be the big winner out of this whole situation, moving into a top 6 role, but Panarin out of the lineup is going to hamper this team going forward, no question. Ottawa Senators, this team, they were going to be pesky, we said at the outset, but they were going to be last, and both things are holding true. 2-2 last week. Brady Tkachuk leading the offense with 2 goals and 2 helpers. We talked about Drake Batherson being a scoring dynamo in the AHL. Well, that's starting to translate into the NHL now. 3 goals and 1 helper for him. And a guy I've got a lot of time for, and we've got friends at RotoWire who are related to this guy, Connor Brown, 2 goals, 1 assist. Evgeny Dadonov, the veteran, is chipping in now a little more regularly, 2 goals for him. In 3 of the last 4 games this week, the Senators showed why they could be a tough out, and the 4-pack that I just mentioned, a key part of this. The veteran group is leading that way, including these names that I mentioned. In fact, they badly outplayed Montreal on Sunday night, a game that I watched after the Canadian struggles on Saturday. They made it twice over with a very poor effort against Ottawa, but I thought it had as much to do about Ottawa's performance as Montreal, despite the fact that Thomas Chabot is out on the back end. That's a big hole in that lineup. He's dealing with an upper body injury. I don't think it's going to be a long-term situation, so they can breathe a little bit easier knowing that, but every game without him is even more of a struggle than it was figuring to be.
Yeah, Chabot status still uncertain for tonight's game, so that's definitely one that fantasy players, regardless of format, are going to want to watch and see whether or not he'll be in the lineup. Speaking of injuries, Marcus Hogberg is facing a 1 to 2 week absence, which means it's Matt Murray or bust for Ottawa. And more often than not this season, it's been bust. Now, you mentioned he got that win on Sunday, but that's his first win. Actually, I'll put it this way. That's just his 2nd win in the month of February. He's been on a pretty significant skid, yanked from the crease a couple of times. And so it's not good news in that sense for Ottawa, that they're going to have to really rely that much heavier on Matt Murray than maybe they were planning to. In Philadelphia, it was also a rough week for them as well. Our rival clubs have given both of us birthdays this week, Paul. Montreal struggled, Philadelphia struggled. We're both happy. Flyers went 0-1-1 last week. Farabee, 2 goals, no assists. Hayes with 4 helpers. This is a depleted team that's playing without, a handful of guys that would be in the top 6. They don't have Claude Giroux, Jacob Voracek, Travis Konechny. Like, those are all top 6 guys. Then you add in Scott Laughton, Oscar Lindbaum. Even Wade Allison is missing. So it piles up when you have those guys out. Center is probably the one position they haven't really been hurting. They still have Couturier, Hayes, and Nolan Patrick there, but it's been a little thin on the wings, and I think it showed last week in their overall record.
All right, we're going to go over to the Pittsburgh Penguins, AJ, and I think you got a tear in your eye still from the ceremony on Saturday on the weekend, don't you? A great performance by the group that sets these things up. It was a very nice ceremony from what I saw, partner, and I bet you still have a lump in your throat, I'm sure. His current right wing, though, is the guy I want to talk about a little bit, and that's Kasperi Kapanen, only 2 assists in his last 7 games played. I've been disappointed by this disappearing act before, and I wonder what your perspective is on him specifically. They also missed Jared McCann, who's been out of lineup for the past 5 games dealing with a lower body hurt, but he's expected back at some point, and he's been kind of a Swiss Army knife for this team for years, AJ. So I think it's a very key loss. In terms of other players who've been kind of catching your ire a little bit, Chris Letang had 2 goals last week. That's the offensive side of his game looking good. I wonder about the defensive aspect, which has been heavily criticized by you and others much of the last year and a half. Tristan Jarry picking up most of the action in between the pipes, 2 wins in the 3-game starts, and a total of 6 goals against. So it looks like he's got his game in order, and maybe he is in line for a longer run as the #1 goalie. So a lot of questions buried in there for you to unpack, and certainly to talk about Sid Crosby.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the question about Kapanen. To your point, yeah, the numbers aren't great right now. He is having to adjust to playing with Sid and Gensel because they flipped Kapanen and Brian Russ in the hopes of getting Evgeny Malkin going, who has honestly struggled both offensively and defensively. I mean, to be completely honest, Evgeny Malkin has looked human this year, which has not been the case over the course of his career. To McCann, honestly, I don't know where they put him when they get him back. I don't anticipate that they would put him in that top line spot with Kapanen, and take Kapanen off. I don't think they put him on the second line. That third line has been just absolutely phenomenal since Zach Aston-Reese came back. These three guys play exactly like you want a third line, just physical, speedy, and they produce periodically. So are they stuck with sticking Jared McCann in a fourth line role? That'd be a little bit of a surprise, but I don't know what else they do. As far as Sidney Crosby goes, look, the fourth player in that 2005 class to hit that 1,000 game played mark. I hope there's another 1,000 in there for him. I'd probably not, but one can dream, right? So we'll continue to watch him play at an elite level and drive this team. And look, if you're looking for something to watch, that highlight reel was absolutely phenomenal to watch and see all those goals throughout the years and all the milestones that he hit along the way. And obviously, Paul, you'll remember the golden goal up in Canada, which has been the most conflicted goal in my life. Obviously, I'm cheering for Team USA, but to see one of my favorite players score that goal on home soil, it was hard to be mad about it. I'll leave it at that. For San Jose, been getting healthy on defense, I think, is the key here. Erik Karlsson's been out for a while now, since February 13th was his last game, and then Radim Simek has also been out, so they've had to go with some younger, less quality guys on the blue line, guys like Freddie Claesson and Nicholas Meloche, rather. I think I got there eventually. But anyway, without those guys, the blue line's been really stretched for them, and I think that's opened up the netminders to see just that much more work and more pucks. And the numbers haven't been great for either guy. Marty Jones in his last 3 appearances, 1-1-1, .903 save percentage. Devin Dubnyk's been worse. One win in 2 games played, but a .889 save percentage in those appearances. So not getting quality netminding in San Jose. The offense has been okay. Logan Couture, 3 goals, 1 assist, but otherwise not a ton of production out of them. And really, the fact that they went 2-0-1, last week is kind of a miracle, I think, in terms of this team.
Well, they're trying to get a bit of a different look there on their offense. John Leonard has performed admirably in recent weeks and had a nice week last week. And Rudy Balcer, since he got inserted into the lineup as a left wing on the second line, has also chipped in offensively. So there are some newer faces that are creeping into the mix alongside familiar names like Hertl, Couture, and Kane in this front line of this team. But the question marks for me are still in the nets. Marty Jones and Devin Dubnyk, 2 veteran guys. I expect more out of both. Dubnyk particularly has been a bit of a surprise. I know Jones's struggles have been the last couple of years, but Dubnyk came over on the heels of a very nice stretch before joining San Jose, and really he's caught whatever bug it is that infects his team. Maybe it's a lack of a defensive posture. That's best reflected in the numbers of Erik Karlsson. He's had a dreadful year in terms of plus minus. And he's hardly produced offensively to offset that when healthy. But even now that he's on the sidelines, you think, what could this team be if they got the better version of Erik Karlsson back in the fold? He's a far cry from what he was in his glory days in Ottawa right now. And there's another albatross of a contract when you consider the performance that he gave them when he's on the ice. And he hasn't been for the last 4 games. And there's really no good news in terms of Erik Karlsson right now. In St. Louis, there's still a team that is pretty formidable. They only went 1-2 last week, but I think some of the key names offensively continue to hold their own. Raden Chen, 2 goals, 1 assist. David Perron, 1 goal, 3 helper. Mike Hoffman enjoying life here just as we thought he would, a goal and 3 helpers, fitting in like a glove into this offense. And really one guy who's taken that 1-year contract offer and looking to make a name for himself and hit the pay window a little bit harder next year, it's really working out for him as opposed to a couple other guys that we talked about earlier in the show. As well, after a bit of a slow start, Tori Krug is showing off his offensive upside with 9 points in his last 12 games played as the linchpin on defense. He has a plus 13. That's the second best in his career. And don't forget, that was all in Boston. So that's how good he's been for this club. And even bigger surprise, Justin Falk already equaling the 5 goals he scored last year. He was always noted among the top goal-scoring defensemen in the league in his prime. He's rediscovered that prime, and he's also added the fact that he's got a plus 17, which is not only his career best, but one of the best totals in the NHL for a complete 180 from his profile that we didn't see coming. We thought that contract, certainly it drove Alex Pietrangelo out of the mix here, but was this going to be another problem contract in the NHL for a club? But it's looking a lot more team-friendly with the performance he's giving them on the ice.
Absolutely. And one player that also has gotten on the ice lately is Vladimir Teresenko, has begun skating with the team. And that would just be a huge boon to an already decent offense. You know, how they shuffle up the lines when they get Teresenko back remains to be seen. Obviously, he'll slot into the first spot. Do you maybe move David Perron to the other side and bump Jordan Kyrou off the top line? You know, do you just move everybody down so that you have a third scoring line kind of anchored by Mike Hoffman? There's plenty of options there, and they'll see what they can do. One team that's dealing with no options is the Tampa Bay Lightning, and that's the goaltending here. Last week, we talked about the fact, you know, we're like, oh, look, Curtis McElhinney played in a game, and he looked okay, so maybe they won't have to use Vasilevsky quite as much. Well, he got absolutely destroyed by the Panthers this last week. 6 goals allowed on 21 shot attempts, .714 save percentage there. If you used him on DraftKings, you got minus .63 out of him. If you use him on FanDuel, you got minus .72. So not a good night at any stretch, and it's part of the reason that Tampa went 0-2 this last week. They did get back into the win column last night, so hopefully that's a sign of things to come. The offensive support wasn't really there either. So bad net minding, poor offense, and Volkov, Alexander Volkov got 2 goals in his last 3 games. But that's about it for last week in terms of production. Stamkos and Palat chipped in 3 points apiece in their last 3 games. But, you know, not a lot happening right for them right now, which is why, shockingly, you find them sitting in third in that division. Look, if there's a team that I thought could lead their division wire to wire, it would have been the Tampa Bay Lightning. But they're behind not only Florida, but also Carolina. And they've got Chicago even nipping at their heels right now. So it'll be one to watch. I don't anticipate we're anywhere close to a situation where Tampa doesn't make the playoffs. They will be a playoff team, but whether they can win the division, I think, is in doubt for the first time this year.
Well, and you know what? You use that term, and I'll use it right away after watching the Maple Leafs performance last night and noting the fact that they are as injury ravaged as any club around the league. In the middle of last week, I thought this team is a juggernaut. What can possibly stop them? Look at the numbers by Matthews, leading the league with 12 points in the 4 games played. Marner, 2 goals, 6 assists. Riley with 5 points. Thornton with 7 points. Not bad for a 43-year-old guy. Outstanding performance by him when he's healthy. But that's the tip of the iceberg, AJ. And Kerfoot is 2 goals and 3 assists last week as well. Injury updates abound here on this roster, though. Thornton, Hyman, and Muzzin all missed last night's game. The 2 forwards should be expected back in the lineup fairly quickly. Hyman had the unfortunate occasion to get hit by shots in the same foot, either side of the foot, in consecutive games, and that kept him out of last night. But I think these are 2 Warriors who will be back in. The third one, Muzzin, another Warrior on the blue line, had a facial injury on the heels of the Canadiens' 3rd goal on Saturday night. On the follow-through of the shot, he got hit in the face, and it broke a bone in his face, and that's going to keep him out for a little while. He'll come back with a face shield, but I expect him to log his 20-plus minutes a night on a regular basis going forward. It's just a concern for me that the Leafs get these shiny new toys in the likes of Thornton and Simmons and company, and they're on the sidelines right now looking in. I wonder how much better this team will be if they can ever get all hands on deck. But right now, I'm a little bit concerned after what I saw last night in the 3-0 shutout loss.
Well, I think the bigger concern to me, you mentioned a bunch of pretty impactful injuries, but Freddie Anderson, a late scratch last night, and dealing with a lower body injury. I would imagine because he was originally set to be the starter, that you're expecting him back relatively soon, but it's always a concern if a netminder of his caliber picks up any sort of injury. And look, if they still had Jack Campbell, I would be a little less concerned. But if they have to use Michael Hutchinson for any length of time, they're going to need Matthews to score even more points than he already has been. Let's just leave it at that. For Vancouver, another disappointing week as they went 1-1-2. I mean, I guess they got a couple extra points with the OT losses there. But Miller with a goal and 4 assists, Horvat 2 goals and 1 assist. I expected way more out of this team. Now, I understand with the change of the netminder there being a pretty big impact, but you're looking at, they're sitting 6th in what should be a pretty wide open, North division here, especially when you only have 7 teams going for it. But they've played 2 more games than even the next closest team, and they're sitting in 6th. So that's not a good sign for their chances of making the playoffs. What's most concerning for me, though, when you look at all that, is the goal differential at -13. It's obviously Ottawa makes everybody look bad or better at a -33, but that -13 is one of the worst in the leagues, and definitely a concern. And I think heading into the year, I don't think netminding was a worry. At least it wasn't for me when you had Braden Holtby and Thatcher Demko as your 1-2. I figured they'd be fine. And as long as Petersen and Miller continued to produce, Quinn Hughes, and then you had Holtby Demko, it seemed like a formula for success. But right now, Vancouver really struggling to get wins.
And a team that struggled to get wins last week was the Vegas Knights. Golden Knights went 0-2 in games against Colorado during that 7-night stretch. The potent offense being limited to 4 goals against in the 3 games that they played against Colorado in that entire series that just concluded. Marc-Andre Fleury, though, is a story in the Nets, taking the goalie load while Leonard has been sorting out an upper body injury. The Flower has 6 starts under his belt and allowing only a total of 12 goals against to show everybody that he's on top of his game, and he should continue to shoulder the load going forward, although it looks like Leonard should be available to play at some point. They have no clear timetable yet for him, but he's with the club right now and should anticipate his return very soon. There also, I would think that the Knights are looking for a little bit of forward depth out here. Nobody outside of Tuck or Glass is contributing much of anything in the bottom 6 forwards, AJ, and that's something that I didn't foresee at the beginning of the season, that this scoring would be so concentrated among the 2 scoring lines here. That's something that the Knights are going to have to address at the trade deadline, which is still a few weeks away.
Well, I'll have to add, as our listeners know, this is practically the Marc-Andre Fleury fan club podcast here. The Flower got a shutout last night to put him tied with Henrik Lundqvist for 64th overall. And while that is really impressive, look, we always talk about are Wayne Gretzky's records untouchable. I think we're overlooking the fact that Marty Brodeur's records might be untouchable. You talk about Henrik Lundqvist and Marc-Andre Fleury both sitting at 64 career shutouts. That's half almost of Marty Brodeur. He has 125 shutouts in his career. You look at the goalie wins, that number is just astronomical as well in terms of where he sits. 691 for his Marty Brodeur's career. Again, looking at comparables, Marc-Andre Fleury's at 474, Henrik Lundqvist at 459. I don't know that those records are ever going to be reached, just in part because nobody plays as many games every year as Brodeur did. Guy was playing 70-some games in an 82-game season. So I just, I totally agree with what everybody says about, some of Gretzky's records being untouchable, and they may be unless guys play longer careers. Ovi obviously is chasing him in a couple of those categories, but Marty Brodeur, I think, is probably going to end up being untouchable on both those lists.
Are you telling me that you're this new stats man? Is that you're throwing out all these numbers like crazy? That's awesome.
Absolutely. I'm taking over as the stats man here. Speaking of the Washington Capitals, a good week for them as they went 3-1. TJ Oshie, 2 goals, 3 assists. Connor Sherry, 2 goals. Backstrom, a goal and 3 assists. So getting production from all additional levels of the game here. If there's I won't even call it a concern. If there's something to be a little worried about, maybe, is the fact that Obi's got 1 goal in his last 5 games. But even that, that's not a big concern. This is a guy that will score eventually. A little mini slump like that isn't anything to really be worried about. And from whether it's a fantasy or a fan standpoint, I'm not expecting any sort of slump, if you want to call it that, for Ovechkin to last that much longer.
No, I think he really benefits from a great partnership that he has with Nicholas Backstrom, who's on top of his game. So that alone should be a big thing to elevate him. The chemistry that those guys have is something that I haven't seen too many other dynamic duos like them over the tenure that they've enjoyed in Washington. Finally, we close it out with the Winnipeg Jets. This team is solidly in contention in the North Division, just as we thought they would be. Mark Scheifele leading the offense with 4 goals and 4 assists in a week that saw the Jets win 3 out of 4. Neil Pionk has emerged as a real dynamo on the back end. We thought that we saw this coming last year. He's fitting in right now seamlessly. 2 goals, 3 assists for his marks to improve to the point where he's among the league leaders in defenseman scoring. Mason Appleton, 2 goals for him, chipping in and finally showing a little bit more of a growth along his learning curve. But it was Dubois, who is the recent acquisition from Columbus, who was impressive last week for me. I saw his game where he played a stellar role in getting 2 goals and 1 assist. Dominating performance by him on the left wing on the top line. That's something we can talk about a little bit, AJ. We didn't see that coming. We thought that they would stretch the offense by inserting him as another center here alongside Stastny and Scheifele. But he's on the wing, in fact, with Wheeler and Scheifele, and that looks every bit as good as the top lines that you might identify across the league, with the perfection line in Boston and the Leafs top line in Toronto. It looks like it's unclear to me whether that's a long-term plan or just a way for him to get acclimatized to playing the Jets' way. So that remains to be seen. But wherever they put him, I'm sure he's going to be a key contributor going forward. But the luxury here is they have an added flexibility, because guys like Appleton, Adam Lowry, and Andrew Kopp have shown the ability to be offensive contributors in the bottom 6. And so that allows them the luxury of experimenting like this. We mentioned Neil Pionk on a scoring tear. It's now scoring points in 9 of his last 10 games. He's a must start in DFS play, I think, whenever he's on the ice.
I think what's surprising about having Dubois on that top line is the fact that they're not getting production out of Paul Stastny right now. I would have thought if Stastny was playing really well and producing, then yeah, you don't need to put Pierre-Luc Dubois as the second center or even the third center. But they've got just 1 assist from Stastny in the last 5 games, no goals over that stretch, and that's despite over that 5 games averaging almost 3 minutes a night on the power play. So his numbers haven't been great, which is why I'm definitely surprised that they put Dubois up on that first line.
Well, AJ, that wraps up our look around the league. We want to thank our listeners for tuning into PuckCast with Statsman and AJ, RotoWire's signature fantasy hockey podcast, with the support of our sponsor at Owner's Box. Please remember to send your comments or questions on Twitter. Follow me, Paul Bruno, at Statsman22. You can follow AJ at AJ Schultz24. Don't forget, you can watch this pod on YouTube at RotoWire Hockey. And as always, we invite you to listen into PuckCast to get our tips to stay out of the competition in your fantasy hockey and planning research. I'm going to close the show also, AJ, by wishing you a happy birthday. I know we both share the day.
You as well.
So have a great time with that, and good luck with the birthday bunny, my friend. And to our listeners, please stay tuned for our DFS segment, which will follow shortly. We want to help you to try and win money on FanDuel and DraftKings. Look to our picks on a limited schedule tonight. It'll come up in a minute.
Please like our video and subscribe to RotoWire. Then go to rotowire.com/pod for a free 10-day trial.